And this girl shall fulfill 2 great deeds, and then die. Every year on the 8th of May, the residents of Orleans mark the city's Liberation Day, when Orleans was freed by royal French troops, led by Joan of Arc. On the morning of this day, citizens and guests gather in the Orleans Cathedral to listen to a Mass in the name of Saint Joan of Arc. In the middle of the day, people gather on the Place du Martroi, on which stands the statue of a horse bearing the great French heroine, dubbed by the people the Maid of Orleans. Delegations from across France pass through the historical parts of Orleans connected with the Maid. A theatrical equestrian group passes through the city, led by a woman in knight's armor. All of this demonstrates the undying love that the French people still have for Joan of Arc. The Grand Master cursed the king and his descendants. The king and his 3 sons died in succession without leaving any heirs. The straight line of the ancient Capetian dynasty was broken. In accordance with Salic law, Philip VI of Valois became King of France. He was the nephew of Philip IV. The grandson of Philip IV through the maternal line was the English king Edward III of Windsor, who laid claim to the French crown. He declared a war on France which was to last more than a century. After a string of victories over the French, Edward created the most noble Order of the Garter under the auspices of St. George, in order to consolidate English knighthood. The Order's headquarters were and are located to this very day in St. George's Chapel and Windsor Castle. The war between England and France, known as the 100 Years' War, proceeded with varying success. During this time, power was passed down through several generations of monarchs in both kingdoms. In England, the House of Lancaster ascended to the throne. Towards the end of Charles VI's rule, the king who was known as Charles the Mad, France had lost the majority of her territory. The English king Henry V, married to the daughter of the French king, sought to unite both kingdoms under one crown. At that time, when the threat of extinction was hanging over the French kingdom, on the eastern edge of France, among the beautiful hills, forests, and fields where the river Meuse gently flows, in the village of Domremy, a girl called Jeanette lived with her parents, brothers, and sister. Jeanette grew up in the normal way for all children in large peasant families. She helped her mother by doing a lot of work around the house. Jeanette's room was most likely very simple, with a small window and no frills or fancies. Her parents, Jacques d'Arc and Isabella Romay, loved their children. Jeanette helped them. She grazed sheep in the pasture, spun yarn from their wool, and wove cloth. Next to the house was the village church of Saint-Remy. The inhabitants of Domremy noted Jeanette's unusual piety. The young Joan sincerely believed in God and was a true Christian. She often visited the Saint Remy church, where she prayed, confessed, and took communion. At that time in France, a struggle for power began between the relatives of King Charles VI, who was unable to control the kingdom. The Armagnacs, led by the Duke of Orleans, and the Burgundians, led by the Duke of Burgundy, fought for regency over the mad king. The Duke of Orleans was killed in Paris. His place was taken by the younger son of King Charles, the Dauphin. Supporters of the Dauphin Charles killed the Duke of Burgundy. The Duke's son Philip sought to avenge his father. The battle for power between the French princes was joined by the English king Henry V, who crushed the French army at Agincourt. The union of Philip and Henry V was joined by Isabeau, and the English king was declared the successor to the French crown. The English king Henry V and the French king Charles VI both died unexpectedly. The Duke of Bedford and the Cardinal Bishop of Windsor continued the integration of the two kingdoms under English control. At this time, 13-year-old Jeanette was visited by strange voices in her parents' garden, coming from the direction of the Saint Remy church. According to the girl, visions in the form of the Archangel Michael and the Saints Catherine of Alexandria and Margaret of Antioch persuaded her that she had been chosen to save the Kingdom of France. The voices also visited Joan in the town of Bois-Chanou, which translates as the Oak Wood, not far from the village of Domremy. Nowadays, the Basilica of Bois-Chanou stands there in commemoration of those historical events. It is known from Joan of Arc's memoirs that the voices directed her thoughts and actions. The visions prepared her to fulfill her historical mission of placing the true monarch on the French throne, the Dauphin Charles. The young Joan went to the castle at Vaucouleurs to convince Captain Robert de Baudricourt to help her gain entrance to the Dauphin's court at Chinon. Influenced by her speeches, the captain organized the journey of this unusual shepherdess to Chinon. She was accompanied by 5 armed guards and carried a letter to Charles. Joan would never again see the place of her birth. Chinon Castle was the residence of the Dauphin Charles. The unrecognized king and his court were protected by the powerful walls and towers of the castle, towering over the river Vienne, a tributary of the Loire. After overcoming many difficulties, Joan arrived at the castle for her meeting with Charles, which took place in the large hall, now lying in ruins. It was here that the famous meeting took place, when the Dauphin hid among his guests and the maid found him with the help of her voices. After their private conversation, Charles made the decision to put Joan in command of the French army. A decisive battle was unfolding in Orleans. The English gradually surrounded the city, preparing for a siege. The despondency of the city's inhabitants dispersed when they heard rumors about a maid who was bringing an army to save Orleans. Joan's entry into the city was greeted with joy by the people. They all believed in the prediction that France would be ruined by a woman, referring to Queen Isabeau, and restored by a virgin. In Orleans, the house where Joan of Arc stayed while the city was freed has been preserved. People came to the house in support of this unusual young woman who was committed to lifting the siege. It was from here that the Maid led the military operation against the English. A bridge over the river defended the fortified gateway of Les Tourelles. The ruins of its stone pillars can be seen from the river. The gateway was seized by the English at the beginning of the siege. The townspeople were forced to destroy the part of the bridge closest to the city. Nowadays, the location of Les Tourelles is marked by a cross. It was here that the decisive battle for Orleans unfolded. After prayers on the 7th of May, 1429, the Maid led the French army to the fort. Having crossed the river and overcome the English defenses, the French reached Les Tourelles and began to storm the fortifications. Joan of Arc led the charge herself, showing the direction of attack with her flag. The fort was captured by midnight. The residents of Orleans welcomed the French heroine with delight. The English quickly abandoned their fortifications. Orleans had been freed. The first task that the Voices had given Joan was accomplished. After that, the Maid led the French army to victory at the Battle of Patay, and together with Charles marched successfully to Rheims. The towns along their way, including Rheims, fell to the French without any resistance. In Rheims, a cathedral was erected, dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Previously on this site stood the church where Saint Remigius baptized Clovis, king of the Franks. According to tradition, Rheims Cathedral of Notre Dame became the place of coronation for almost all French monarchs. Joan of Arc brought the Dauphin Charles to Rheims Cathedral of Notre Dame for his anointment and coronation as the King of France. The Archbishop of Rheims performed the sacred ritual of proclaiming Charles the King of France. The anointment played an important role in the process of proclaiming a new king. According to legend, Saint Remigius anointed Clovis, the king of the Franks, with myrrh from the holy ampulla. An angel in the form of a dove had carried this holy ampulla with myrrh to the bishop of the Franks. The holy ampulla was kept in the abbey of Saint Remy, which was adjacent to the Basilica of Saint Remigius. A divine vial protected the spirit of Saint Remigius, the bishop of the ancient Salian Franks, whose relics are located in a sarcophagus in the eastern part of the basilica. Early in the morning of the 17th of July, 4 royal horsemen came to collect the divine vial and take it to Rheims Cathedral for the coronation. Charles, Joan of Arc, the Archbishop of Rheims, and members of the nobility and clergy gathered in Rheims Cathedral for the coronation ceremony. At the altar, the Archbishop, in the presence of the Maid, anointed Charles VII and placed the crown on his head. The Virgin Mary and the Christ child were witnesses to the Maid of Orleans fulfilling the second mission revealed to her in Domremy. It was a triumph not only for Joan, but for the whole of an exhausted France, personified by a shepherdess from Lorraine. According to the predictions about the Maid, she would have to endure another trial, her capture and a hearing before an ecclesiastical court on charges of heresy. At the height of her fame, Joan of Arc tried to take Paris. The siege of the city failed. In the end, circumstances brought Joan to Compiègne. The fortress walls protected the inhabitants from the Duke of Burgundy's forces. All that remains of them today is the tower. The commandant in charge was the experienced Captain Guillaume de Flavy, a relative of the Archbishop of Rheims. He was a loyal subject of the French king. At dawn on the 23rd of May, 1430, Joan, along with a small detachment of troops, broke through the Anglo-Burgundian outposts and rode into the city from Compiègne Forest. She hurried to the church of Saint Jacques in Compiègne. Joan of Arc prayed for the success of the military operation to lift the siege around the city, a plan which had been discussed with the commandant of Compiègne, Guillaume de Flavy. The Maid of Orleans prayed fervently for success to be sent to her people in the coming battle against the Anglo-Burgundian forces. But a feeling of foreboding stayed with Joan as she left the church. The assault on the Burgundian forces began after midday, but the attack across the bridge was unsuccessful. The French began to retreat, with the Maid covering their escape. Suddenly, on the orders of the commandant, the gates closed in front of her. Joan of Arc was surrounded and dragged from her horse to the ground. In the place of her capture, a monument to the Maid of Orleans has been erected to remind people of the conspiracy against her. The betrayal which Joan had predicted had come true. The Burgundians and the English were elated by her capture. Joan of Arc became the prisoner of the Burgundian captain, Count John of Luxembourg. Having learned about the Maid's capture, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, came to visit her in person. After the Maid's capture, negotiations began among the participants of the 100 Years' War regarding Joan of Arc's fate. Joan was brought to Beaurevoir Castle, where she remained under arrest for about 4 months. The French king did not act to try to secure her release. The Duke of Bedford sought the Maid of Orleans' transfer from the Burgundians to the English. Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, hesitated for some time. He understood that Joan was a national symbol of France and that they shared the same French blood. The Archbishop of Rheims, Regnault de Chartres, represented France in the negotiations. Joan's fate didn't concern him. He sought to make peace with the Burgundians and remove the Maid from the political stage. The Cardinal Bishop of Winchester sought to arrange a trial for the heroine in order to prove her links to the devil and thus overturn the coronation of Charles VII. The man who organized Joan of Arc's purchase by the English for a sum equivalent to a prince's ransom was a bishop from the town of Beauvais, Pierre Cochot. At the start of the 15th century, the main city in Normandy, Rouen, was the most English city in France. On Christmas Eve 1430, Joan of Arc was brought to Rouen. Here it was decided to conduct an inquisitorial trial into the accusations of heresy and sorcery, in order to determine which satanic events the maid had been involved in, under the influence of her voices. Joan was incarcerated in the royal castle of Bouvreau on the outskirts of Rouen. It was one of 7 towers where the prisoner was kept. If it existed today, the tower would lead out onto a street named after Joan of Arc. One of the towers of Rouen Castle has been preserved. Nowadays, the tower is a museum dedicated to Joan of Arc's stay in that prison. In this tower and other castles, Joan was interrogated under the supervision of Pierre Cochot, the bishop from Beauvais. The Cardinal of Winchester oversaw the judicial process. A preliminary commission was headed by Anne of Burgundy, the wife of the Duke of Bedford and the sister of the Duke of Burgundy. The commission confirmed that Joan was a virgin. The tower is a grim reminder of the difficult conditions that 19-year-old Joan of Arc faced towards the end of her life, when she was under constant psychological pressure. Her hands and feet were chained and shackled. There were always guards with her, and they humiliated her. The interrogations of the maid were debilitating and contained complex religious questions. The testing aimed to persuade Joan of Arc to speak heresy, but she withstood the tests honorably. Then, in the Abbey of St. Owen, preparations for the execution began, and, under the influence of Pierre Cochot, the illiterate young woman signed a recantation and agreed to wear women's clothing. But on the orders of the bishop, the prisoner was returned to her previous jail. Joan realized that she had been deceived and forced to renounce the voices. She began to wear men's clothing again. According to the Inquisition, this was a relapse into heresy. There was only one punishment for this: execution by being burnt at the stake. The old market square in Rouen is a well-known place. It was here that the maid was executed. A church has been erected nearby. A cross marks the place of her execution. On the 30th of May, 1431, Joan of Arc was told that she would be burnt at the stake. The maid was brought to the old market square, where the bonfire had been assembled. Joan was tied to the stake, and after her sentence was read out, the wood was set alight. "Bishop, I die because of you," she proclaimed, speaking to Pierre Cochot. When the flames from the fire were engulfing her, her final words were to Jesus Christ. Then the soul of the maid ascended to heaven. King Charles VII is buried in the St. Denis Basilica. Before his death, he set the rehabilitation of Joan of Arc in motion. The Burgundian Duke Philip the Good accepted Joan of Arc's unusual nature at the end of his life. After the Maid of Orleans' death, the French and Burgundian sides signed a peace treaty, as Joan of Arc had often called for. The French gradually drove the English out of the mainland. The French heroine's dream had come true. Her beloved France was free. Joan's main persecutor, the Bishop Pierre Cochot, ended his life in Lisieux, where he served in the local cathedral. He was buried in a vault next to the cathedral. On the walls of the vault are reliefs showing the bishop atoning for his sins in front of the Virgin Mary. Joan of Arc is a national symbol of France. Her short life is a shining example of service to God and country. The Catholic Church canonized the Maid of Orleans. Her statue was erected in many French cathedrals and churches.